Okay, so hello and welcome to this CCSE conversation. This is an initiative of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events at the University of the West of Scotland. The Centre has developed from a collaborative partnership between UWS and Renfrewshire Council. CCSE provides a space to undertake collaborative research and development work that has local, national and international relevance. So for this conversation, we have the pleasure of having the company of Dr. Michael Edwards from North Carolina State University's Department of Parks, Recreation and Tourism Management. Dr. Edwards specialises in sport for health and community development, rural physical activity and health, youth sport, sport organisational management and programme evaluation, and is also a youth women's soccer coach at North Carolina Courage FC. So NC State's Department of Parks, Recreation and Tourism Management is dedicated to enhancing the social, environmental and economic well-being of communities worldwide. So today's focus will be surrounding sport culture in the US and especially soccer, with questions surrounding soccer or football development, for example, at youth level, and also surrounding the Men's World Cup, issues of human rights and its potential legacy for soccer in the US and other related topics. So welcome, Mike. How are you?
Doing well, thanks, Callum.
So my first sort of question is just what has been your career path or progression and your relationship with sport just in general?
Yeah, sure. So it's somewhat of an eclectic background from both a player and a professional perspective. I growing up in rural eastern North Carolina here in the U.S., the options were fairly limited, and I did grow up playing the sport of baseball primarily. I got the opportunity when I was in high school to study abroad through a Rotary exchange to Blackburn in the Northwest. And I learned, a lot more about soccer. I learned a lot more about rugby. I came back and did play soccer at high school level, and then played rugby through rugby union through the university. Coming out, I actually spent close to 10 years working in professional baseball on the management side, the business management side, and then picked up playing soccer again as an adult later in life. And then I had two daughters and started coaching them and continued to coach the girls' side now. So that's been my playing background, my professional background, and my continued volunteer sort of role in sport.
Nice, yeah. And in terms of your university career, how did that work out? In terms of your job and undergrad and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I again, so I did an undergraduate in history. After I had my sort of first career, I went back and got a master's in exercise and sports science, which is really my focus kind of physical activity, and then my doctorate here at NC State. I spent a few years as on the faculty of Texas A&M University, and now back at NC State. And really the driving kind of passion of my research is about, I would say, developing healthy sport, particularly for youth, but in general, creating more healthier sports systems, particularly here in the U.S. So,
okay, perfect. And how and why did you become involved with mega events and human rights through the Event Rights Project?
Yeah, sure. Part of it, I think it comes back to as we were doing some of our previous research on legacies, and having the opportunity to work with, again, the Football Foundation of South Africa, and kind of getting to understand a little bit more about the legacy of the 2010 FIFA World Cup down in South Africa, and then just sort of thinking through some of the ways in which sport can be very unhealthy for communities, can be very unhealthy for sort of social systems, if not sort of focused progressively on the human rights agenda. And so for me, it just simply became a matter of just connecting that to the idea of wanting healthy sports systems. And part of that, I think, whether that's for local populations, whether that's for the athletes, whether that's for the grassroots level, how can we leverage these mega events in order to create healthy systems and ensure that they are not making negative health impacts on their communities. And health I use pretty loosely with the kind of the WHO definition, which can be physical health, mental health, social health, spiritual health. All that seems to be wrapped up into this hosting. And so for me, it was about a very visible level of sport in a community that has the opportunity to sort of set an example for very healthy sport, or can continue to be very unhealthy in its interactions with the host community.
Yeah, so just in terms of youth sport in the US now, could you talk me through how youth sport generally runs in the US? Just from your
Yeah. So again, you can't really talk about youth sport in the US without sort of recognizing that it's completely a pay-to-play model.
Yeah.
We do have sport in the schools, particularly at the high school level, but that is even the high school sport, while for the most part could be considered free as part of the school process. Usually, making those teams requires you to be very engaged in the pay-to-play system.
Okay.
So from a very young level, we're really seeing it in all sports, this sort of tiered system where those with the means will have access to the programs, will have access to coaching, will have access to facilities, and those that don't may or may not have programs to engage with. And so, and we're seeing, and again, to be fair, since there's no real governmental or system to fund grassroots sports, it is left to the private sector, and because of the private sector has to generate revenues, it becomes a pay-to-play model. And so pretty much from top to bottom in our system, while there is some community sport through municipal parks and recreation in some levels, those are generally lower level, entry level sports, and to progress beyond that, it becomes pay to play.
Okay. Yeah, so that was kind of my next question. Would you say there's sort of equal opportunity to access youth sport, or probably not if it's the
No, I think the evidence is pretty clear that it is very hard to access sport without the financial means, and we see that in the demographics of who's playing youth sport in the U.S. And I think in many ways that divide seems to be getting wider. So just an example, imagining the old local town, we think of Little League baseball, and so it used to be for generations, towns would have their own league with multiple teams where all the youth in that, predominantly boys, but some level of town league where they could all play. Now, because more and more of the players with means who see, say, the travel teams as a way for their kid to get to the next level, they're paying thousands of dollars to join these leagues, traveling all over the country to play in tournaments, and they simply don't have the number of youth in the town anymore to form those local leagues. And so those local leagues have now gone away in many places. The kids who have access to the means to join these travel leagues can do so, and those left behind do not have a really good infrastructure in place to provide support. So I think, and again, going back to, and many of these clubs will talk about their scholarship programs, and they do. They have programs where if you are willing to apply and share your family's financial information, they can provide some subsidy.
Okay.
In many cases, that will only cover that entry fee, and so just from my own experience of my daughters playing, you've also have thousands of dollars in travel and in kit and in other kinds of ancillary expenses that wouldn't be covered by those scholarship funds. So even having the ability to waive that fee still doesn't take the fact that our system's in place that just costs a lot of money to play sport at the youth level.
Okay. And which kind of groups have you been involved in terms of soccer teams or maybe sport for development organizations?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm pretty active in our local club, North Carolina
Mhm.
Football Club, and NC Courage, who are really, I mean, they're probably one of the largest youth soccer clubs in the world.
Mhm.
Over 15,000 youth playing in the club, from entry level recreation all the way to the very elite level of youth sport in the U.S. And they also have the academies for the professional teams, North Carolina Football Club on the men's side and North Carolina Courage on the women's side.
Mhm.
And to be fair, they do a lot of really good community work. They do have lots of programs for different levels of skills and desire to travel or not travel. End of the day, it's still a very expensive prospect if you want to play at the highest level.
Uh,
So definitely, I've been working in that area. We've had the opportunity again to do some work with the Hoopbas Foundation in South Africa, the Football Foundation of South Africa, that have really done some amazing work with some of their programs and kind of developing some evaluation capacity for them, which has been a lot of fun. And we're actually hoping at the moment to develop a program to develop an exchange of coaches between North Carolina Football Club and the Football Foundation of South Africa to allow us to learn from each other, because there's been a lot of desire on both sides to be more inclusive, to how we can better engage in communities through our football programs. And so I think there's a lot to be learned there, and hopefully that will happen, and we can develop that type of program.
yeah, sounds good. Um, and what kind of demographic do you see involved with the North Carolina football clubs from your experience?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it is predominantly white middle class. I mean,
Mhm.
from a participation perspective, and particularly on the girls' side, I think the girls' side is almost exclusively, I would say, white middle class. I see very little diversity on the girls' side of the game here, but on the boys' side, a little bit more diverse. You see a little bit more racial ethnic diversity.
Uh,
I think particularly with North Carolina has a very vibrant and growing Latino community, and particularly this area. So we're seeing on the boys' side, particularly, a lot more Latino Hispanic
mm,
players. We haven't seen that translate as much on the girls' side, and there's we've written some articles. I've written an article. One of my former students who was a Latina led an article on kind of looking at some of those cultural differences with
mhm.
ethnicity and gender in the Latino community, to explain some of that. But we certainly would love to see more diversity on the girls' side,
Yeah.
but on both sides as well. But again, by and large, very white middle class in the youth soccer world here.
Yeah. And do you think that's the pay to play model again, or is it something
Yeah,
deeper? Or
I think it's more complex. I definitely think there is something to pay for play, but again, there's been there's been a lot written about race, ethnicity, and sport participation,
mm,
and some of it is that constraints aspect of the access. I think there's some replication from you see we just see this in terms of different race and ethnicity groups sort of being more attracted to different sports because that's where their friends are playing. That's what is sort of society's told them this is the right sport for you. Some of that
okay.
gets ingrained into the kind of the cultural norms. And so I think it's kind of a complex system,
Yeah.
and I don't know that there's one direct answer to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we do see certain concentrations of different race and ethnicity and genders into particular sports. So
Uh,
I think that's something that we would see here as well.
okay. Yeah, and in terms of your coaching, are there like protocols in terms of coaching courses you have to go through, or sort of safeguarding rules, or anything like that you and the other coaches have to go through?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, and I can speak specifically to North Carolina Football Club, but also some general aspects as well. For most clubs, there's going to be safeguarding protocols. So we will have to go through the safe sport training, which is depending on who you ask, is really good or not very good. But it's one of those things that they've got to tick a box to say that we've got some safeguarding in place, and so do have to go through that. I do think it could be better in terms of ensuring that training is taken on board by the individual coaches. We also will go through background checks again, which has its flaws, but it's a process that's in place. And so every coach, in order to be on the field with any contact with kids, and that goes for volunteers as well, with each of the teams, has to go through the safe sport and go through the background checks.
Okay.
So that's the one thing. In terms of coach training or coach education as it relates to the coaching, there's not a whole lot of requirements there at different levels. So at the highest levels, there would be some expectation that coaches would hold some type of U.S. Soccer Federation license, and typically that would be in place there. For the volunteer coaches, and that would be at the competitive level, even the recreation level, there's no requirement in place for the most part for coaches to have any kind of license or badges or whatever. Some do, some don't. Again, because we're talking about volunteer coaches, it's very hard for a lot of them to go and do the coaching badges. It's also very expensive, and soccer requires fees for this, and ongoing fees for maintaining your license, and ongoing fees for access to the coaching center. So I think a lot of volunteer coaches are already giving up a lot of time and money, personal money to involve this. It's one more thing that's not very they're just not going to do that. And I think that's kind of the case across most sports. So there's very little requirement in terms of coach education. And some of it has to do with tradition. We just doesn't have U.S. sport just hasn't had the same level of expectation of coach training as other countries have done. And there's been some research done that essentially that kind of Americans feel that if you played the game, then you know how to coach it. And even that kind of is loose in some cases. And that does have its issues, particularly replicating. I mean, a lot of the the issues we've seen, particularly on the girls' side in soccer, the women's side at the very elite level, have come from a place where a replication of coaching styles, of personalities, of interactions, particularly of men coaching girls and women, that have fostered a kind of sort of problematic relationship and power dynamic that perhaps with better education system in place, better selection system in place for coaches, might help reduce that to some degree. But because that's not in place, and because it's really about replicating the style with which you were coached, without a lot of other input into that process, we do see some of those issues.
Okay. Yeah. And do you think the clubs would sometimes finance, like say, their volunteer coaches to go through these badges, or is that not a sort of usual thing?
Yeah, it's not usually going to happen. To be fair, again, North Carolina Football Club has they've done some things that I think are pretty forward thinking and innovative relative to like providing some opportunities, and some of those may not be the full badges for the courses, but maybe some modules and components of it where they even to the point of bringing in coaches from the FA of Wales. They've got the Scottish FA have some staff coming over, and they're going to be here for a weekend, and bringing in coaches to go through some sessions, and so trying to do some things like that. I do know that they have provided some grassroots courses, particularly for women coaches, trying to get more women coaching, because that certainly is an issue now of not having enough women to coach.
Yeah.
I know that they would like to have more on the girls' side. And so they've provided some of the basic grassroots courses for women. So they've done some of that, but at higher levels, I don't know. Certainly for their professional coaches, that they probably would do some of that. But for they've got so many volunteer coaches, and I think a lot of clubs that NCFC is not one of them, but a lot of youth clubs are sort of operating in very, very narrow margins in terms of financially. And so to add that cost would be not practical for them. So
yeah. And are the football clubs or soccer clubs? I know you've written a lot about community capacity building. What kind of way do they work in with that, or is it more schools and that sort of thing, or are are they big into that sort of thing as well?
I think it depends. I definitely would say that depending on the community, depending on the capacity of the club themselves, certainly NCFC is really very involved in partnerships with kind of schools, with communities, with other nonprofit organizations, in terms of building capacity around the community. Just one example is they have worked with the Busey Foundation, which is a nonprofit, to build mini pitches around the area. Hopefully provide some more accessibility for some lower income communities to have access to places to play. But again, I think when I do think the NCFC and some other bigger clubs around the state are somewhat of an outlier in terms of their organizational capacity to be able to do those kind of things. But for a lot of clubs, already have pretty low capacity even to operate their programs, and so for them to go beyond that, even though partnership would probably increase their own capacity. In addition to sort of develop community capacity, I don't think they often see far enough to think about how that would work, and so they're sort of much more internally focused.
Okay, yeah. And speaking of just soccer in general, what would you say its place is in the US today, like in terms of against sort of American football and baseball, basketball, ice hockey? Where does it lie, and where does it think it's going?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would still argue that it's in a pretty positive progression. When you look at participation rates, while certainly soccer has plateaued in terms of growth, it's maintaining, and it has a really high participation rate. I would argue that if you look at American football, if you look at baseball, some more traditional sports, I think those participation rates are declining at such a rate that I think they would that are going to be pretty equivalent eventually.
Okay.
I think hockey is definitely growing, just primarily because it hasn't been a very sort of popular sport, particularly outside of kind of small regions in the northern part of the U.S. It's kind of grown into the South. So I think there was a big growth opportunity there, and we're seeing that. Lacrosse is another one that we're seeing a lot of growth with. Okay. But I think those are also very expensive sports. With hockey, access to ice is very limited, so that I think they can only grow so far. I think with soccer, thinking about from both a participation perspective and a spectator perspective, I think it's somewhat poised to really explode in a lot of ways, and one of the ways I would say is simply generational. So we're finally reaching the point in our kind of our sport culture where we've got 3 generations that have played soccer. I think having that socialization process where you have grandparents and parents and children who all know the game, have engaged with the game in some way, I think that makes a pretty big impact in terms of your kind of interest in watching the sport.
Yeah.
And for a long time, you had that with the kind of the traditional sports of, again, baseball, American football, and not that I think that I don't see anything in really soon where soccer is going to eclipse American football in terms of the interest level of watching
Yeah.
it. But I do think generationally, and certainly Gen Z, who have grown up playing soccer, parents played soccer, they know soccer, they've been encouraged to watch soccer. They're seeing it as sort of a different kind of sport, and that generation wants to be kind of unique in many ways. Soccer is really what they're latching onto more so than the other sports, and so I do see kind of this groundswell of interest in watching the game because of the socialization that's happened, and some of the unique characteristics of Gen Z.
Yeah, and do you think sort of the traditionalists, so to speak, they're still kind of against soccer because it's a sort of foreign game to them, or is there less of that?
Yeah, I would definitely say there's less than that. I think you always have, one or two kind of voices that argue that, it's un-American, it's not, I don't, we don't, they don't score enough. I think that it's one of those sports that as they watch, as they get to understand sort of the nuance behind the game, they tend to like it more. Certainly the World Cup gets increasingly watched by multiple generations of in the U.S. But I think you always have those voices. I think you're seeing them less and less in the media than you used to. You definitely used to have certain voices on air, but I don't think that they have much of an audience. Not that there isn't going to always be that factor for for a while now. But I definitely think it's very much seen as much more part of the kind of the major sports scenes now.
Okay. Do you think the '94 World Cup in the US sort of helped the swell of support for it?
I think in some ways, I think '94 and then '99, the Women's World Cup, both had their place in developing. I don't know that the U.S. capitalized on '94 as much as they could have. Yes, it launched Major League Soccer. I think there was a lot of hiccups in that process of launching Major League Soccer, but I don't know that they were really thinking as I'll say this. I think that there was an expectation that that this demonstration effect was going to happen, that everybody was going to get excited about the World Cup, and then they were going to go out and play soccer. And I think we've learned enough about hosting mega events that without the infrastructure and leveraging of those events through multiple channels, that's not going to happen. So I don't necessarily know that happened to the degree that people think. I think there was some other factors in play that got the U.S. to the World Cup in '94 that were already sort of happening relative to soccer. And I think that combined again with '99, with the growth of the women's game, and with the honestly, with the global kind of explosion of the English Premier League, getting those games broadcast in the U.S. and seeing that high level, I think there were lots of factors over the last 30 years that have kind of led down this road.
Yeah, perfect. And so kind of going from there to now, how do you feel about the World Cup coming to the US and Canada and Mexico in 2026?
I mean, I'm excited about the joint bid. I mean, certainly I'm one of those that believe that the U.S. probably should have had it sooner. But I'm always a big fan, with taking these mega events to countries that have some level of infrastructure in place, so there's not this need to just build everything from scratch. I definitely believe that the U.S., Canada, Mexico, North America are well poised to host these events. And so I think it'll be exciting to have here. I mean, again, I'm hoping that there'll be some good sort of local leveraging of the events. I think that they've definitely put the games in places that most folks could get to.
Okay.
Even though, again, we're a very geographically large country, but so hopefully there'll be some opportunities there. But again, it'd be nice to have the World Cup back here, just to see, again, how we learn how to leverage this in a way to make some positive contributions to the game here in North America.
Okay, perfect. And in terms of like the human rights protocols and all that sort of thing, do you think it's a good idea for a joint bid to kind of try and implement those across the three national contexts, or how do you think that would play out?
Yeah, I mean, again, I like the idea of the joint bid. I think that there is a lot to be said about that. I think all three countries have their own set of kind of human rights issues that need to be addressed, and maybe this is an opportunity to at least bring some of those into the spotlight. I think we'll have to wait and see in terms of how much, other than just kind of the typical lip service we get to the human rights from the governing body and from the host communities, whether or not anything happens. But again, just like we've written about in some of our papers, I mean, it's going to take the advocacy organizations, right? It's going to take the labor unions and to say, hey, we need living wages for workers in the U.S. and Mexico. We need to recognize our relationship with First Nations in Canada, for example. We need to kind of address the human trafficking aspect of mega events in the U.S. like we have with the Super Bowl every year. So are we going to actually have those advocacy organizations working with the host communities and the overall bid committee to make these things happen? We'll see. I mean, the good thing is I think that as much as we can criticize the U.S., Canada, and Mexico for human rights issues, and we should, at least there are certain expectations in place relative to the ability to speak, the ability to have some of this discourse be allowed. I think the one thing that's coming up, and this is back to the U.S., I think there's certain host cities that are in states because of the new sort of legislation that's happening, because of new sort of, particularly on the anti-LGBTQ community, and other sort of rights restrictions that are being placed, particularly on women in these states. I really think there's going to need to be some discussions about some of the, and some spotlight placed on some of those host cities that are in those states or they're enacting those legislations. And again, if the World Cup puts the games there and they don't, then I think that they've missed an opportunity to really use the event to push for some of these progressive human rights changes.
Okay, and who is it? Do you think who's it up to stop those sort of, not saying backwards, but those kind of laws that are sort of not up to date? Is it up to like state government, or is it up to FIFA or advocacy organizations? Who's responsible?
Yeah, I think you'd like to see something. So I mean, again, I was using the example of my home state, in North Carolina. We had some really regressive legislation focused on the use of bathrooms by transgender individuals, and it led to the NBA pulling their All-Star game from Charlotte until the bill was overturned and was more inclusive. And so, is FIFA willing to pull games from Miami or from Texas if legislation continues to progress that was really restrictive on human rights? I don't know that they are. I don't know that they are so willing to say that the human rights agenda is a priority, that we're willing to pull those games. So how, if that's not going to happen, can we really expect to see major changes in legislation based on hosting the World Cup? It's hard to say. I think that certainly between now and in 2026, we need to use that to really shine some light on those human rights issues. So, and again, nothing changed in 2022 in Qatar, despite a lot of questioning the human rights agenda there. So I don't expect major things to happen, but at least hopefully it'll shine a light on those issues.
Yeah. And speaking of FIFA, it's a big question, I suppose, but what are your thoughts on FIFA and their kind of reform and their human rights, processes, policies and that sort of thing? What's your take?
I tend to be an optimistic cynic. So on the one side, I'm optimistic in that I think that whether by their own accord or by external pressure, that they see that in the future there is going to be an expectation by the public, by consumers, that human rights and the actions of organizations, whether that's for progressive human rights, whether that's for environmental rights, the triple bottom line, there's going to be this expectation that you're going to have to operate in that kind of approach in order to be seen as relevant in this next generation consumer. So I'm optimistic in that. I'm cynical in the fact that I believe that whether it's FIFA or IOC, or they're going to do whatever the minimum required to sort of put out there that we're progressing. Now, I do believe that that again, there's been some good outreach from these organizations to partner with advocacy organizations to try to keep themselves in check, but ultimately, as long as they can continue to generate profits, then there's no real need to change. So I don't know that they're going to go out there and say we're going to make these changes just out of the for altruistic means. It's going to have to be something that's pressured by the consumer.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough, I suppose. And do you think it'll take until 2026 until we see what's actually happening to make a difference, or do you think they can put those policies in place and kind of have a legacy before the event, like they can have enough change and sort of processes in place that are already done before the event actually happens, or do you think it'll be after the event, maybe 5 or 10 years, where we see they're actually have made a true change, I suppose?
I mean, again, if we're being smart, you'd like to see things in advance, right? Because we know that as we get closer and closer, particularly on the human rights side, once the World Cup gets here in 2026, it's almost too late. And so the only leverage you have is the hosting agreement, and there's just not a lot of opportunities to police changes after the fact or even while it's happening. And again, and the feel good fact, we saw this with Qatar. The feel good factor, once the games start, is going to kind of wash over any issues while the actual tournament is taking place. So I think we have to leverage this time between now and 2026 if we want to use the World Cup as a mechanism for any kind of change.
Yeah, perfect. And in terms of the main human rights issues in the US, I know it's a big place and a lot of different contexts, but what would you say were the main human rights issues in the US when the bid was sort of announced that it was going to try to be taken to the US? And then, have they been addressed, or how can they be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, some of it's really hard. I think we have certainly issues with racial and ethnic discrimination and violence, racial violence, police brutality. We have issues with certainly with gun violence in general. We have issues with labor and paying living wages, particularly for and I use the term because it's common, but I don't agree with it. Unskilled labor. We've got issues with absolutely with a growing issue in some states with LGBTQ rights, with women's access to health care, whether that's abortion or other access. So there's a lot of very complex human rights issues that often are it's going to be a big issue. I don't see the World Cup in as big of an event as it is being something that's going to come in and change all that. I think that there are some small scale areas of consciousness that can be raised through hosting the World Cup that will hopefully continue to progress us in some way. I feel like on the human rights issue here in the US, we seem to be taking 3 steps forward, 2 steps back over multiple years. And so I believe that's going to continue. And again, hopefully hosting the World Cup with a clear human rights component to the hosting agreements will at least shine some light, raise some consciousness in those areas, and hopefully can be somewhat of a force for good and change some very complex human rights issues.
Yeah, so it's more of a starting point, you'd say, the World Cup is, and as the consciousness rises after that, that's when it will be more transformative, I suppose.
Hopefully, because again, unless FIFA is willing to say hold host cities and really their states, feet to the fire, so to speak, where hey, if you don't change these legislative agendas, then you're not going to get the event. I don't see that happening. And I don't see. I know American politics well enough to know that some of these politicians are not going to make changes at the level that would need to be just to host the World Cup. So I think it's going to have to be a matter of using it as a way to shine a light on some of these issues.
Okay. And going to the more of the playing side now, having 2 soccer playing daughters yourself, how do you think the World Cup will impact them and kind of future generations in terms of legacy for playing and for just the infrastructure for youth and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. So on one hand, we're probably more excited about the upcoming World Cup in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, right enough. Yeah.
But it's I think in many ways it'll be exciting. Both my girls will be one will be well into university and one will be about to go to university. So they will kind of just be more probably that stage, more excited as fans than anything else. I think on the youth side, I think that there will be some opportunities certainly to get excited about hosting the World Cup and sort of what that means. I think in the age of television and media, I don't know that it's going to be massively different than the excitement of watching the games on TV. Certainly live soccer is great to watch, but we're seeing that the mediated events is becoming more ubiquitous in how youth engage in the sport these days. Watching from an infrastructure perspective, I don't know how significant it's going to be. And again, if this were a other countries where, and I honestly can't speak for Canada or Mexico, I speak for the US, where there isn't like this sort of government kind of process for funding grassroots sports, where they could say, right, as part of this bid, the US is going to fund these grassroots infrastructure. And you saw this with some other mega events where, and I'll just use the example of the Rugby World Cup, where they were, with the Rugby Football Union in England were really working with local clubs to kind of build infrastructure for training and things like that. I don't necessarily see that happening here because I think from a training perspective, most of the countries are come in probably using university facilities
Hmm.
that are already top class. I mean, I
Yeah.
would say that you've seen our training facilities, things of
Mhm.
that here at a Division I NCAA school. I mean, they're gonna rival the top professional
Oh
leagues
yeah.
in the
Mhm.
world. So there's not as if they're going to build infrastructure that are going to be used by youth
Yeah.
to train on. But and because there's no funding mechanism, coming
Yeah.
from U.S. Soccer or the other federations down to that grassroots level. I mean, honestly, the money travels up. I mean, we
Yeah.
pay fees to a club, then go up to fund U.S. Soccer versus U.S. Soccer sending money out for grassroots infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
honestly don't see a massive impact
Yeah.
from hosting this on grassroots infrastructure at all.
Yeah. Because we talked earlier about the equal opportunities sort of thing. So there's a lot of talk of, anti-discrimination and inclusion and all of FIFA's human rights policies and sort of, all the media going out. But I suppose after you're saying that, they'll probably not have any sort of tangible impact for the low income communities in terms of participation or anything like that.
I mean, I can foresee, and just in some of my work with rural communities,
Hmm.
perhaps there will be some sort of program in place, whether that's through the U.S. Soccer Foundation or
Hmm.
others, to try to generate facilities in low income. I just don't see it being a very well or sustainable process that's
Yeah.
actually going to make a big difference. I mean, if we get some fields built in sort of low income communities, great. But again, without the infrastructure in place, without some way for clubs and organizations to really implement programming,
Yeah.
it's not going to change the system. I mean, it's still going
Yeah.
to be a pay for play system. And certainly we've got a great Boys and Girls Club here in Wake County that does some soccer programming
Mm.
with low income communities. They certainly could use increased capacity, and maybe that's a potential way to do this. But I just don't see a widespread
Mm.
change happening that's going to change the system.
Yeah, take a massive sort of overhaul, I imagine. It's just,
Yeah,
yeah.
and there's simply just too much incentive at at every level of the game to keep the
Mhm.
system the way it is.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I have no more real questions
Okay.
for you. So all I can say is thanks for coming on and
Yeah.
for joining us.
I thought you were going to ask me about the economic impact.
Oh, flip, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's had a flip in there. But if you want to talk about that,
No,
um,
it's funny. Usually when people talk about the World Cup, they talk about, oh, this massive economic impact, and I would just leave with the fact that there's just really no evidence whatsoever that this is going to make a significant economic impact.
yeah,
We're talking about in the North America in particular, we're talking about a time of the year when these countries and states and cities get large influx of international tourists every single year,
yeah,
regardless of hosting a World Cup or not. And so we're talking about a large number of tourists that are simply going to displace those that would normally be here
mm,
on any given year. And so we're not going
yeah,
to see some massive influx. For other countries that have to, that may not get the same level of tourists at the time. Yes, they may get new tourist dollars, but the cost of
yeah,
building the infrastructure to host the World Cup is typically so great that it offsets any type of influx of tourists. So
yeah.
all the hype you hear about the economic impact of this is probably just that hype.
Yeah. Because I had it written down there, but I was just went past it.
No
Um,
worries.
but yeah, no, fair enough. And I suppose as well the corporate sponsors who benefit the most from all that is probably not the local businesses as much. And yeah,
Yeah, that's not necessarily money that's going to stay in the community. So
yeah, that's true. But yeah, I have no more real questions for you.
okay.
But if you have anything you want to
Nope.
say to me or ask me, then far away. But I'm happy enough.
Nope. Nope. Great.
Yeah, just thanks very much.